Hello, and thank you for tuning into our militarism series. My name is Jarvis Benson, and I am on the policy team at the Khury Center. I have a background in international studies, and I'm currently a PhD student in sociology at UNC Chapel Hill. During the series, we will sit down with various organizers and scholars and talk with them about the violent manifestations of U.S. militarism and where we can go from here. Today, we will talk to Khury Petersen-Smith. Khury is a Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches U.S. empire, borders, and migration. Khury graduated from the Clark University Graduate School of Geography in Massachusetts after completing a dissertation that focused on militarization and sovereignty. During our discussion, Khury speaks on the history of American exceptionalism and why we must work to combat it. He also links the anti-Asian racism we see escalating on the domestic front with the long history of U.S. imperialism and military violence in Asia. Finally, he speaks to the relationship between Christian nationalism and militarism today.
Oh, thanks. So I am just like trying to write so to give some like background.
Yeah, please.
So, I am on the policy team with the Khury Center, which is like
Okay.
one of the anchor organizations of the Poor People's Campaign.
Right.
And we are like doing like a deeper dive into like militarism and like US imperialism and all of these things. And so I'm trying to like think about like some like pieces that we could like write about like different kind of like spheres of like US imperialism. And so I know that you have done like a lot of like really great work around like the Middle East and have like written some like really powerful things about like Palestine and China and like all of these like different like interconnected issues. And so I just wanted to like talk through some stuff with you and like could potentially like use this kind of chat to write like a piece about like you and like your thoughts. Does that sound
Definitely.
cool?
Like anything, anytime. Like I'm just happy to be a resource, and so yeah, 100%.
Okay, awesome. Well,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
What Khury, what are your pronouns? So like when I'm writing stuff up, like I'll know like
Sure.
whatever you want to.
Appreciate that. Yeah, he, him is cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
How about you?
Cool. He, they, or any
Yeah.
pronouns, honestly,
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Beautiful.
All right. Well, to get into the kind of questions that I have like pulled up, how did you like originally get involved in like militarization generally?
Yeah. So, it really, I feel like militarization um has been part of my life for my whole life. I mean, maybe that's true of all of us, but for me in a very in a way that was like I was pretty conscious of. So like I come from a military family, so I have a lot of extended family in the military, and I uh, like learning about U.S. militarism as a child was really impactful for me. So I remember in elementary school, a teacher read to us about just this book called Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Have you ever heard of that book?
Heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's about about the atomic bombing of I think Nagasaki, if I remember right. And yeah, and that's how I learned about the atomic bombs, and that was an extremely impactful book for me. I learned about like US in Iraq, like as a child, and like just the history of invasions and sanctions against Iraq. That was really impactful for me. And then I learned about Palestine when I was in high school. I had before I learned about Palestine and Palestinians, I had kind of heard I learned the kind of Israeli narrative, that like
Right.
after the Holocaust, the world decided that the Jews need a home, and thankfully there was this empty desert, I was kind of waiting for them.
Where nobody was at. Yeah, yeah.
Where nobody was living.
Yeah.
And then they made a great country, and I was like, great, and so then I learned about Palestinians, and it was, again, I didn't know any Palestinian folks, until years later, but I had this great history teacher, white guy, who one day he was like, kids, today I'm going to tell you why the Palestinians are so pissed off. And he just told us a story, and he showed us the maps of like the loss of Palestinian land. It just blew my mind.
Yeah.
So that was really impactful. And so it was like things like that I learned about, like U.S. sanctions against North Korea when I was in high school. That was like the way I learned about it was I learned there was like a famine in North Korea at the time, and that these sanctions made it so that the U.S. it made it illegal to give food to North Korea, which was, I was like, what, I learned about U.S. colonization in Puerto Rico, and I was learning about all these things, and then I got involved in the anti-war movement in college, when the U.S. was kind of like post 9/11, like U.S. is invading Afghanistan and Iraq and occupying, and so all those are really, that's kind of the those were all formative experiences. I should say too that like learning about those things while like having relatives in the military, it gave me a particular kind of perspective on it, because I feel like I learned, I was learning that the US does just indefensible, horrendous things. The people who are in the military carrying out those things are also three-dimensional people. They're not just like these monsters. They're people with family and who love people and whatever, and also also done these things, but and that they themselves are actually mistreated by the military, so all of that has been really important.
And I was going to ask, like, why do you think that like we have this kind of like idea that like the US is like off and doing great things, and like when we're confronted with like the stuff that you like learned in high school, it's like a huge shock. Like, why do you think that like that history is there, but like we don't like kind of discuss it in like a colloquial type of sense,
Yeah, that's such a good question, because it really is like, you're right. There's this kind of like, there's this kind of like dissonance. Like when people learn about something that the US does that's wrong abroad, it's like it does not compute, and I think there's a few reasons. One is like, I think the way that we are taught US history, so much of it is that like, we learn history in a way that really just embraces colonial violence in a way that we don't even recognize it. I mean, when I think about, one exercise that I think is useful is like, think about like, what's the first history lesson you ever got in your life in school, right? And like, I know for me, my very first history lesson that I remember ever was in kindergarten, when I learned about Christopher Columbus. That was the first piece of history that a teacher ever taught me, and it was like, we sailed the ocean blue in 1492. You know what I mean? And it was like, that is what, like, that's the first thing, right? Like, I didn't learn about like the indigenous inhabitants of the people who, who, of the place where I was living, or, like first I learned about that, and about this kind of hero figure. And so that's one thing.
We do the plays where somebody plays the Native American, somebody plays like the pilgrims, and we're like
exactly,
all holding hands.
Exactly. That was first grade, so that was first grade. Then we had like a Thanksgiving story, so that's pretty wild. And then when you get into more of like US history, and like, you know, I think the big one is World War II. You know, the narratives that we learned about World War II are, I think, like, whether consciously or not, a lot of Americans have as like the go-to in our minds, you know, like this idea that the world is being threatened by fascism. The United States doesn't want to get involved. It's trying to avoid it. It's trying to just do its own thing. There's this thing happening in Europe, you know, but finally, you know, reluctantly, you know, we get dragged in because, you know, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, even though this Hawaii wasn't even a US state at the time, you know what I mean? Like, there's nobody's like, why was the US Navy out in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific, you know, what's that about, you know? And yeah, the US kind of reluctantly saved the world. And so, you know, I have a friend who grew up she's Japanese, she's from Nagasaki. And you know, obviously the people in her life and her life has been shaped by this atomic bombing. And she did like a study abroad in the United States when she was in high school. She studied in Michigan. She said her first day of school, she goes to history class, and the teacher's doing this exercise that history teachers all across the country do, which is they like set up a chart on the board, and it's like the pros and cons of dropping the atomic bomb. You know, what were the good things, what were the bad things? And she was like, it's the first time in my life that I heard that there was a pro. Like I grew up learning that this was a terrible thing, but Americans learn this balanced view, you know. So I think that's really important. And then the last thing I'll just put on the table is like, there is, you know, the US is this, it's this really interesting country because there are actually people here from all over the world. And I didn't quite like grasp the significance of that until I got to travel a little bit. And like I went to, you know, Mexico City, which is amazing, you know, like, which is probably my favorite city. But
Mexico City?
Mexico City is amazing.
Love Mexico City.
Oh my God, it's amazing, right? So you've been there, right?
It really is. Yeah.
So a huge city, it's like 25 million people. It's for the most part 25 million Mexicans. You know what I mean? It's not like a super diverse place, right? You know, and that's true of many world cities, you know, and many countries in the world. The United States has people from everywhere, including and probably especially like places that have been very affected by US imperialism. So I think about like what happens to prevent all these people who actually know a thing or two about what the US does abroad from talking about it. And it's just violence, honestly. I mean, you think about like World War II, what was happening? The US rounded up 100,000 Japanese folks, right? Or Japanese American folks. And that is every war, there's like this really repressive side here. I think like the war on terror has made for this like, you know, war on Muslim folks, on South Asian folks, on Middle Eastern folks here, which does a lot of things. But one of the things is it means that like when people, you know, when people do have knowledge, it's hard to vocalize it, right? I have this friend who, you know, one time he like went to this falafel place in Boston. This is like years back, when the US had a more kind of active and visible like occupation in Iraq. And you know, so my friend goes to this falafel place. There's this Iraqi guy working there who owned it, and they ended up just like chit-chatting, and the guy ends up saying, yeah, I'm from Iraq. And my friend's like, oh, okay. He's like, are you Sunni or Shia? And the Iraqi guy's like, dude, like, it's not like that. You know what I mean? Like that's not how I identify. He's like, that's not what's going on, you know?
Yeah.
And my friend was like, huh, like it actually, it disrupted this narrative in my friend's mind. But how often do like, we get to have conversations where Iraqis or Afghans or Palestinians or, you know, any, you know, Koreans or you know, any number of people get to say, you know what, I know you've heard one thing, let me actually tell you like what I know. Yep. That doesn't happen because I think people are intimidated, people are, you know, are face violence, people are told that you have to prove that you're an American. So, so I think all those things make it so that it's, it's very, I think it's genuinely challenging actually for Americans to know what the US does abroad, even though for people who live around the world, like their primary encounter with the United States is the military. But if you live here, it's hard to get a sense, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, I want to talk more about like the violence part, because I think that like the way that our status quo is like sustained by violence, like both like internationally and like domestically too, is just like underscored. And like the idea of like, incarceration and like being like, even like community policing is like a real thing. And we've seen this kind of played out over and over again, I think, like for the past several, since the founding of the country. And so I'm wondering if we can speak more about, like, you talked about it in like, your piece around like anti-Asian racism. And so maybe expand on that. What's like the relationship between militarization in the communities and in like abroad, and like what can we think about there?
That's so, I mean, I so appreciate that question, because it's like, so the way I think about it, so there's a couple of things. One is, so much of how the US works, there's this kind of ideology that, the US is what it is because of ideas and beliefs and values, right? Like the US is the world's most powerful country because Americans are just, we believe in working hard, we believe in, democracy, and that's a really efficient form of government, and we believe in free markets, and that's the best way to have an economy. It's all about like, beliefs and values, and it's like, it's really honestly violence. Like that's, I mean, that's how the US is the richest country in the world, because it dispossessed indigenous people and then had enslaved Black people, and that's the foundation of the country, and then has just exploited waves of immigrants, who has also, and all those people faced severe repression for this to work, so I think that's important to just like, it's like, let's challenge this idea that, power comes from just, being good people or believing in good values or whatever. And then the violence piece, man, like I think of so the way I think about it is like in like circuits of violence, like violence that is so central to how the US runs domestically, that then gets kind of, that informs how the US exercises power abroad. And then with the violence that the US carries out abroad, it comes back and informs the way that things operate here too. And that is, I think that has been the case literally, from the beginning of the whole kind of project of colonizing. I mean, this country, it emerged through violence. It was a colonial project, so and then, now, like there's any number of ways that it gets like embodied in these really, like I think about like, at the moment, there's just a very clear circuit between domestic policing and military, action abroad, right? Like if you're a veteran, there's incentive to come back and join the police force. There's a few years back, the Boston police killed a Black man, and the officer who did it was shot. The man shot him, or in the process. Actually, it wasn't clear actually if the man actually shot him, but the officer was shot. And part of the public conversation was like, this officer is a veteran, so he was keeping us safe by fighting in Iraq, and now he's keeping us safe here. And it's like, wow. I mean, there is a connection, right? And what does it
safety
mean?
From what?
Protecting from what and from who, right? And like, so who is this enemy, right? Like, so the same person who's like a threat to our safety in Iraq is also a threat to our safety here in Roxbury, which is the heart, the Black neighborhood, in Boston, the heart of Black Boston.
Yeah.
So there's all, and the kind of all kinds of racism, but it would say anti-Black racism, it literally shows up in the, like the racial slurs that the US has invented to describe, Arabs, to describe Filipinos back when the US was occupying the Philippines. The slurs were informed by racial slurs developed against Black people. And then again, conversely, like soldiers go and fight abroad, they carry out horrendous violence, and they come back and enact that violence here. There's a place for them here to do it here. So yeah, it's a circuit.
Yeah, gosh, that's really interesting. I think like the piece around like language and like the use of language as like a dehumanization, like, and like how that's deep.
It's wild.
It is. It really is. So I guess like maybe to go back to or to like think about like the pandemic and like your words about the pandemic, which I think were really great. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there around like the pandemic and the military. I think I'm really interested in your thoughts around, why do we focus so much on the war? Why didn't we focus on public health? What are the consequences of that? And then how do we, I guess, like, how is this like spending come at the expense of our like public welfare?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, so I guess the thing that I came to as like a sort of like heading or overarching heading is like, this is a country that is over prepared for war and underprepared for literally any other problems facing our society. We're underprepared for climate change. We're underprepared. I mean, even things that are entirely predictable. California catches on fire every year. We all know, that it's going to happen. And yet it's like this weird surprise, every year. And there's no preparation. There's not enough resources to deal with it, right?
Yeah,
and then the pandemic, again, people were talking about for a long time. We had all these, it's wild. You think about like, you can remember all these similar pathogens like SARS that happened before COVID, right? There was MERS, there was Zika virus. I mean, there are all of these other pathogens that are not only, it's interesting too, like, to the extent that there's been any conversation about the origins of the pandemic, it's like, China, it's basically like this kind of way that you can blame China. Oh, it emerged from, carelessness or, and then there's conspiratorial stuff about a lab or whatever. But there's not a conversation about like, the kind of, I don't know, like commercial reality that we have that also like means that, I mean, the way that this pandemic has spread has been people flying around the world, and that's only, it's not the whole world population that's like flying. It's been a disease that's been spread largely by affluent people. There's no conversation around like, the incredible commercial systems we have. I mean, like, people order something on Amazon from anywhere in the world and expect it to be here in 3 to 4 days. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean in terms of like the safety of all, think about all the hands that it changes, all the people involved. So anyway, there's a lot that we should be talking about that has like made it this way. But to go back to your question, I just like, it's wild to think about just the things that have been, that are so, well, I'll just say the military, like the military and all of its infrastructure, the bases in this country and all around the world, the operations, the US is carrying out exercises all the time, simulating the invasion of countries. That's just what it does. Because, most of the military is actually not fighting wars, most of it is preparing for war, what they call readiness. And all that stuff is considered untouchable. Like they couldn't they couldn't press pause on, you know, some of it ultimately was disrupted. You know, I mentioned in the piece that you had these outbreaks on dozens of naval vessels, you know, and they finally were like, all right, I guess we have to address this. And it's like, why were these vessels sailing? Was it really that important for, you know, the USS Roosevelt to be sailing around to Asia? What was it doing? You know,
Yeah.
what was it doing that was so important in the midst of a pandemic? You know,
That had to be like, you know,
that they had to be doing this mission, you know. So, but all that
yeah.
stuff is untouchable. We couldn't even talk about it. All of the medical facilities that, I mean, the military has its own hospitals. The military has its own stockpiles of medical equipment, of ventilators, of masks, you know, and occasionally over the past year, the Pentagon has like donated, you know, donated as though it's like a
Yeah.
corporation making a,
private
you know,
thing, yeah.
yeah, as though this wasn't paid for with tax money, right?
Yeah.
They've donated, you know, masks or ventilators or whatever, and it's like, why was not every military hospital immediately opened up to civilians and placed under civilian control, right? So yeah, it's just it's so hegemonic that there's nobody questioning these things.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think, yeah, and maybe this leads to my next question, which is around like January 6th at the Capitol. And there's like all of these like questions around like maybe like the connections between Christian like nationalism and militarism. But like these are also folks that are like actively like pushing for like more militarization. So like folks are like understanding of the issue and like have like a pretty like astute analysis of like what's happening. So it's not like a lack of education type of thing from what I understand. It's like however like what are like the roots of that, and like how do we like build the political will across like this like very like weird thing that's happening?
Yeah, do you mean like the kind of this like kind of white nationalist, Christian nationalist militarized thing? Yeah. Okay, so many thoughts. Let me just, and it's I think it's a little complicated because like there's so on one hand, like there is a far right in this country that is like organized unto itself, you know, the 3%ers, the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, you know, all those. And then there's also this stuff that is really kind of like the fact is like the US project as a whole, and including its military project, it really has these elements of white nationalism and Christian nationalism that are actually pretty foundational, you know. So it's a little hard to say where one ends and one begins sometimes, and in many ways actually like these far right figures, some of them are, you know, you know, there's like the weird kind of conspiratorial QAnon stuff that's like a very just distorted picture of reality, but others have a very clear-eyed sense of this country actually. And I'll say Donald Trump in particular is like, you know, I remember when like the press conference after the Charlottesville attacks, you know, where Trump was like, well, there's good people on both sides, right? And like journalists were just like, what are you saying, right? And Trump, you know, he turned it on him and he was like, well, you know, he's basically like you know, yeah, I don't know, the people on the right basically have a right to be upset when the left is and Black people are tearing down these statues. And it was really interesting because, you know, journalists who are part of like liberal and mainstream media were kind of like, you know, no, there's something legitimate about these, you know, the confrontation of these Confederate statues. And Trump was like, well, where does this stop though? Because Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were slave owners too. Are we going to tear down their statues? And I remember he asked that question at the press conference, and there was no response because they didn't know what to say. Because I think that they're like, you know,
Yeah,
he's
didn't
right.
expect that. Yeah.
He's right. Like the founding fathers were slave owning, you know,
Yeah.
self-aware
Yeah.
colonizers.
This is what we have. Like, this is what we're defending.
Yeah.
So like,
yeah, they're
what do
like,
y'all want? Yeah.
this is the project. We have to steal the land and defend it by violence. And Trump knows that.
What's not clicking?
Yeah, he gets it. Or even like the you know, the fact that like one of the things about the Trump presidency that like he grasped right away. Trump was on a permanent campaign. I mean, his campaign started obviously before the election, before the 2016 election, he's running or whatever. And the campaign rallies were out of control, but those rallies continued right through his presidency. It was like his favorite thing about being the president, right? It was like he would get to go to West Virginia and he'd go to the Florida Panhandle and he would talk about wild things, and people would say shoot the migrants, and people would cheer, or they would chant Brett Kavanaugh. And you know what I think Trump grasps that that certainly the Democrats don't grasp is that politics is not fundamentally won at the ballot box. It's actually won. It's won in the streets, you know, and it's won through. Fundamentally, it's won through force. And I think that's what January 6th was all about. They were like, yeah, no, we will disrupt this, you know. So
as we have, as we will be, and gosh, that is so real. That is for real,
right?
Golly, you're right. Trump had that in the bag. Like, he knew
he got it
coming in. Like, what he got it, because that's what this project is. Like,
and he got it.
You don't understand what this.
Exactly. He gets it very, very cynically, because he's like, I'm not a Christian. He's like, I don't care about, like, clearly, obviously, he has no, you know, I was actually, there's this really interesting conservative evangelical man, I forget his name right now. He's in South Carolina. And he like has one of those kind of, you know, conservative evangelical radio talk shows. Sure. And he did this super interesting, I'll try to dig it up and send it to you. He did this really interesting story on the show This American Life, which basically documented how he saw his listenership become Trump supporters. And he was like, this makes no sense to me. He's like, we're talking about a man who has no value system at all. And I think that's actually accurate. Trump, at least what he expresses, is no commitment to any morality, but he's very clear. He's like, we're going to support Israel for the evangelicals. Totally cynical, like, not because he believes, you know, but because it's a totally.
He understands a project, who supports a project, and what that project means for the world. Yeah,
exactly. So he gets power.
He gets power, and we get power. And how we get it. Okay, Khury, I have a stop. I have another meeting at 2, but I have one more question if you're up for answering one more.
Yeah. I'll keep it brief.
No, just wondering, like, what are the issues then, like, based on all of this, what are the key policy issues that we need to ask, like, this administration? And do you see any potential for some actual change?
That's a great question. I mean, man, there's so many things. But I think that right now, let me say this. I think that we need to completely rethink, you know, the way that the U.S. exercises power in the world, and I think rethink the U.S.'s relationships. Like, you know, there's a, you know, I mentioned in the piece, I think, like, you know, the U.S. has an antagonistic, hostile relationship with China, and it's therefore not surprising that there's antagonism and hostility, against Asian folks here. That is how the U.S. behaves.
Yeah.
The U.S.'s relationship with Iran is based on, there's this amazing scholar, Azadeh Shashahani, who works at Project South. She's a human rights lawyer. We've gotten to work together on U.S. policy toward Iran, and she says, the policy the U.S. has is about domination, not dignity. And it's like, okay, so what would it mean to actually reimagine that relationship and have it be about dignity and not domination, and have it be about recognizing that there are actual real problems that all of us in the world face. These pandemics are not, this particular pandemic and future pandemics are not going away. Climate change is real. The number of people in this world who are displaced is real. The people who are arriving at the border, it's not because like Joe Biden invited them or whatever. It's because, a series of things, including policies by this country, in Central America, have forced people to leave their homes. And, the U.S. needs to join with every country and just be like, what are we going to do about this? So, I think that's what we have to put to the administration. And this is a hard ship to turn around, you know what I mean? Because the US works through domination. But I think that we have to move that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I agree.
Word.
Well, okay. This is so cool. Khury, one of the most brilliant people I've ever got a chance to speak to.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a pleasure to talk, and I'm looking forward to more conversation.
Yes. Okay. I'll talk to you soon then.
All right. Beautiful. I'll figure out how to send this recording to you.
Okay, sure.
All right.
All right. See ya.